It was supposed to be a perfect summer night, the kind you look forward to when you're 15, surrounded by friends and the wilderness. Our scout group had been camping in the Pine Hollow Reserve for 3 days, hiking trails, learning survival skills, and swapping jokes by the fire. Justin, my best friend since we were kids, stuck with me through it all. That night, as the sun dipped below the treetops and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, we set out on a short hike back to the campsite after exploring a nearby clearing. Our scoutmaster, Mr. Hayes, led the group with his usual calm confidence, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Behind him, we trudged along, joking in low whispers to avoid spooking the younger scouts. The forest was alive with sounds: chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But then we heard something else, something out of place. Heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of us. "Probably a deer," Mr. Hayes said when someone asked about it, though his tone betrayed a hint of doubt. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept pace with us, always just far enough into the shadows that we couldn't see the source. My heart began to race, and I glanced at Justin, who looked just as uneasy. Every time we stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped too. I told myself it had to be an animal, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. By the time we reached the campsite, everyone was on edge. We tried to shake it off, gathering around the fire pit as the adults lit a roaring blaze. Mr. Hayes encouraged us to share stories to lighten the mood. It worked for a while. Laughter rippled through the group as one scout told a ridiculous tale about haunted marshmallows. But then, as if on cue, the footsteps returned. They circled us, slow and deliberate. The younger scouts huddled closer together, their faces pale in the firelight. Mr. Hayes exchanged a glance with Mr. Lorne, the assistant scoutmaster, who pulled a revolver from his pack. The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the night, and the footsteps stopped, for a while. "Everyone, stay close," Mr. Hayes ordered, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something sharper. He kept his flashlight trained on the tree line as we all quietly moved to our tents. Justin and I crawled into ours, zipping it up tight. We didn't say much, both too scared to admit how scared we actually were. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. At first I thought it was a dream, but then I saw Justin sitting bolt upright beside me, his eyes wide and locked on the tent wall. I turned to look and froze. A shadow loomed outside, tall and broad. It was a man. He wore what looked like a burlap sack over his head, with holes crudely cut for eyes. In his hand was a long knife, the blade glinting faintly in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. The man stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. I could hear Justin's breathing, shallow and rapid, but neither of us dared make a sound. My mind raced with every terrible possibility, but my body refused to move. And then, just as silently as he'd appeared, the shadow moved away. We didn't sleep after that. As soon as the first sliver of dawn broke through the trees, we bolted from the tent and told Mr. Hayes everything. His face turned ashen as he listened, and he immediately called everyone to pack up. The trip was over. No one argued. As we dismantled the campsite, 2 younger scouts discovered their gear was missing. Extra clothes, snacks, small items. What really unnerved us, though, were the slashes in their tent walls. They were small, almost unnoticeable, but clearly intentional, cut at just the right height to peek inside. The drive back home was eerily quiet. No one joked or sang like we usually did after trips. Justin and I sat together, both staring out the window, replaying the events of the night in our minds. The shadow of that man, his hulking frame, the knife, was burned into my memory. To this day, I don't know who or what he was. Police checked the area later and found no sign of anyone. But I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the way fear turned my blood cold in the middle of that dark forest. Some nights, I still dream about that shadow, and every time I wake up, I swear I can still hear it. The sound of heavy footsteps somewhere just outside my window. We were on a Boy Scout high adventure trip to Colorado, a once-in-a-lifetime kind of experience. Days were filled with rafting on roaring rapids, hiking trails that seemed to touch the sky, and sitting around campfires sharing ghost stories. The nights, however, had a chill that seeped into your bones. I remember those nights vividly, especially one that will stay with me forever. It was our 4th night at camp, nestled close to the Arkansas River. I woke up drenched in sweat, my sleeping bag clinging to me like a second skin. The tent was stifling, even though the temperature outside had dropped significantly. I unzipped the flap and stepped into the crisp night air, letting the coolness wash over me. The moon cast a silver glow over the campsite, and the gentle rush of the river filled the silence. As I stood there, I noticed movement by the riverbank. At first, I thought it was the trick of the moonlight playing on the water. But then I saw him, waist deep in the river, facing downstream. My heart stuttered. It was Wade, one of my closest friends on the trip. His figure was still, like a statue, and the sight was so out of place that a shiver crawled up my spine. "Wade?" I called out, my voice breaking the quiet. The sound echoed in the stillness. He flinched, his shoulders jerking, and then slowly turned his head toward me. The movement was sluggish, like he was underwater even though his head was above it. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and he looked wrong. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted as if he were trying to say something but couldn't find the words. "Wade, what are you doing?" I stepped closer, the rocky ground digging into my bare feet. The river's current swirled around him, tugging at his legs, but he didn't seem to notice. Finally, he blinked, and a look of sheer confusion spread across his face. I don't know," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I don't remember getting here." "What do you mean you don't remember?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Were you sleepwalking?" He shook his head, water droplets flying from his soaked hair. "I think so. I don't know. I just woke up here." I waded in, the icy water biting at my skin, and grabbed his arm. His body felt cold, almost unnaturally so, as if he'd been in the river for hours. He stumbled as I pulled him back to the shore, his legs heavy and unsteady. Once we were on dry ground, we sat in silence, both of us staring at the dark, churning water. "Wade?" I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You could have drowned." He didn't respond, just kept staring at the river like it held some kind of answer. The moonlight reflected off the water, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, just a shadow maybe, but it moved in a way that didn't match the current. I shook my head, trying to brush it off, but the unease lingered. When we got back to the tent, Wade changed out of his wet clothes while I kept an eye on him. Neither of us slept much after that. We tried to convince ourselves it was just sleepwalking, nothing more. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about the river that night felt alive. The next morning, we told the others what had happened. They laughed it off, saying we were probably dreaming or exaggerating. Wade forced a chuckle and nodded along, but I could tell he wasn't convinced either. We decided to drop it, not wanting to be the butt of every joke for the rest of the trip. Still, I kept catching him glancing toward the river, his brow furrowed in thought. The trip continued, and we tried to move past that night, but I couldn't forget the way Wade looked in the water, like he wasn't entirely there, or the shadow I thought I saw. I began to wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't woken up? Would Wade have walked deeper into the river, his body carried away by the current? The thought twisted in my gut, making it hard to breathe. Even now, years later, I think about that night. Wade doesn't like to talk about it, and honestly, neither do I. But every once in a while, I'll catch myself dreaming of the river. In those dreams, I'm the one standing waist-deep in the water, unable to move, while something just beneath the surface pulls me under. I wake up gasping for air, my heart pounding, and I can still hear the river. Always the river. It was October 2008, and I was 13 years old, eager to prove myself on our annual scouting camping trip. The woods felt alive with the energy of fall. Golden leaves crunched underfoot, and the crisp air smelled faintly of pine and earth. I had always been a quiet kid, happier exploring on my own than sticking with the group. So when our scoutmaster suggested a short solo hike to build independence, I jumped at the chance. I ventured down a narrow, winding trail that afternoon, the kind where sunlight barely filters through the dense trees. It was peaceful at first, just the sound of the wind rustling through the branches and my boots crunching the dirt. But then I heard it, a loud, heavy thud somewhere deep in the woods to my left. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an animal sound, not the rustle of a squirrel or the crack of a twig. It was deliberate, like something big had hit the ground. I froze, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent forest. I told myself it was probably a fallen branch or some animal that spooked itself. Still, my stomach churned as I hurried back to camp. I didn't tell anyone about the noise. I didn't want to seem scared or foolish in front of the older scouts. That night, after the campfire songs and ghost stories, we all retreated to our tents. I shared mine with no one. Something I usually loved. The solitude felt like freedom. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the muffled laughter and whispers from the other tents nearby. The chill of the October night seeped through the fabric of the tent, but I felt safe, cocooned in my little shelter. Then, just as sleep began to pull me under, I heard it. A faint crackle of static. It wasn't outside, but inside the tent. My blood ran cold. Confused, I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight. The static grew louder, and I realized it was coming from my backpack. My heart pounded as I unzipped the bag and found a walkie-talkie I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I whispered into it, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was only static. Then, a deep, guttural voice responded, "I'm watching you, kid." I felt like ice water had been poured down my back. This had to be a joke. One of the older scouts must have snuck it into my bag. But that voice, it wasn't a kid's voice. It sounded too deep, too menacing. My hands shook as I held the walkie-talkie. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The voice chuckled, low and slow. "I'm right outside your tent." My breath hitched. Every hair on my body stood on end. My flashlight beam darted to the thin fabric walls of my tent, half expecting to see a shadow or figure silhouetted against it. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Then it happened. The fabric of the tent bulged inward as though someone or something was pressing against it. First on one side, then another, as if circling me. I couldn't move, frozen with fear. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in, and I screamed, loud and raw. The pressure stopped instantly. I could hear footsteps retreating, crunching the leaves as they faded into the woods. Moments later, the other scouts and 2 scoutmasters came rushing to my tent, flashlights cutting through the dark. I burst out of the tent, babbling about the voice, the walkie-talkie, and someone pressing on the tent. One of the scoutmasters, Mr. Rivers, checked the area but found no sign of anyone. "It's probably a prank," he said, though his tone betrayed a hint of doubt. "Maybe one of the older kids thought it'd be funny." "It wasn't a kid," I protested, tears streaming down my face. The voice was too deep, too wrong. The other scouts denied having anything to do with it, and when Mr. Rivers inspected the walkie-talkie, he looked puzzled. "This isn't one of ours," he murmured. Despite his reassurances, no one slept well that night. The next morning, we packed up and moved to a different campsite, further away from the trail. The scoutmasters told us it was to keep things fresh, but I knew the truth. They were spooked too. I never went on another scouting trip after that. Every time I thought about camping, I heard that voice in my head. "I'm watching you, kid." Even now, as an adult, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there that night is still waiting, watching.